the truth. And this morning, a story that we'll be spending a fair amount of time talking about is on the front page of the New York Times. It's also on the front page of the Baltimore Sun from the New York Times wire service, and it's this headline: the president weighs admitting he had sexual contacts. The story, which was written by James Bennett and Richard Burke, Neil Lewis, and others for the New York Times, says, quote, Mr. Clinton would say he based his previous denial in a deposition in the Paula Corbin-Jones lawsuit on a definition of sex approved by the judge in the case. His advisors believe this definition does not cover certain activities, including oral sex. Gary Webb, on that note, good morning to you.
Thanks, that's a fine note.
What do you make of this?
I think this is the most bizarre story I've ever seen. I mean, this is going into definitions of sex now. And to have the president be questioned about what he thinks sex is just astonishing to me. I mean, you read the definition in the New York Times, and we're getting down to things like touching genitalia and touching anuses and things like that. And I'm sorry, I'm glad I hadn't had breakfast yet before I read that story.
Let me continue. An acknowledgement of some kind of sexual encounter poses considerable risk, particularly if it were linked to a legal argument that rests on the narrow definition of sex. The New York Times goes on to say this morning, but Mr. Clinton's advisors have said it poses a greater risk to tell anything less than the truth to a grand jury about sex with Ms. Lewinsky. It is not clear how precisely Mr. Clinton has described his relationship with Ms. Lewinsky to his lawyers. My question to you is, how does the New York Times get this information? Who's talking?
It's the same way that the Washington Post gets the information. If you look at the Washington Post story, it's a very similar story. And the people that are talking, obviously, are the people that are close to Clinton. The question you have to ask yourself when you see a story like this is this real, or is this a trial balloon that's being floated now to see how the public's going to react to it? And this has the earmarks to me of a trial balloon. I think people are trying to see how the public's going to react to the president saying, well, I may have had oral sex, but I don't consider that to be sexual contact.
Before this program began, I was going to ask you why this story is not on the front page of the Washington Post. The early edition does not have it on the front page, but the later editions has this story by Peter Baker that says, counseling a narrow admission of sex. Based on that, could you assume that the Washington Post received this after the first deadline of its early publication?
No, what I would suspect is that people saw the way the New York Times played it and remade the front page to put their story on the front page as well.
We'll be talking with Gary Webb for the next hour and also discussing his latest book called A Dark